We talked with Dr. Bronson Strickland about when is the rut going to happen, when is the peak activity for hunting going to occur, and he shares an insane, very interesting fact about bucks breeding does that I bet you didn't know. Let's get right into it. Here we go. Is there any other good rules of thumb to consider during the rut when in correlation of trying to shoot a mature deer?
This may be a little outside the box of what you're asking, but in terms of a good rule of thumb, this is what I always like to start the rut talk with. There are so many ancillary theories about fine tuning when the rut is going to be, and this year it's going to be a little earlier or a little later, et cetera, et cetera. We have no evidence, and not just with my people at my institution. No research biologist has ever found any evidence for the rut changing to any significant degree from year to year. And if you think about it this way, I think it'll help you better understand why. Keep in mind that the timing of the rut is all about when the doe conceives, when she becomes pregnant, and then we have gestation time, about 7 months. That is all based on the optimal time for a fawn to hit the ground and survive. And so over hundreds, thousands of years in a particular region, those does via genetically, the ones that have optimized the timing of when they come into heat and therefore drop a fawn in May or June or whenever, that is optimized for your environment. And what is the most reliable signal to the doe for when you need to come into estrus? It's not temperature based. It's not precipitation based. It's not moon based, because all that from year to year fluctuates. So a doe, it is not advantageous for her to come into heat at the first cold snap, because in your neck of the woods, the first cold snap could happen in August, or it might happen in September. Well, now you have put a fawn on the ground at the wrong time of year, and it's going to die. The most reliable biological clock is photoperiod, the ratio of daylight hours to nighttime hours. Year after year after year, after thousands of years, you can always have that reliable clock. So I always like to start with that is how you should base your framework on when the rut is going to be. It's reliably year in and year out at about the same time.
There's this notion of you need to be in the tree in the middle of the day because that's when bucks are off does and looking for the next one. In your experience, is there anything to be said about that?
Well, I can say that I agree with the person you're talking about there. I agree that it's always good to be in the stand and be in the tree. I disagree for the purpose as you have described. It's just generally, I mean, we know from observations, from captive deer observations, and now with all this GPS technology with these collars, we know when bucks are most active. It is always, always, always centered around sunup and sundown. But that does not mean they do not move during the day as well. They just move to a lesser extent, if that makes sense. So there's always the peak around sunup. There's always the peak around sundown. There's movements in the middle of the night, but to a lesser degree. And there's movements during the middle of the day to a lesser degree. But if you wanted to take every opportunity you had to connect with a buck or to see deer, then also hunting during the middle of the day is important.
What are some of those good locations for that midday hunt during, I guess, the peak seeking phase of the rut?
I don't know if I have a research-based answer for this, but just looking at the data and kind of me surmising, trying to fit a correlation, it's probably going to be places closer to cover than what we might call destination food sources. I think those where they're traveling a longer distance to go to some really big ag field or food plot or whatever. I think that's, again, I'm using the word I think and
Sure.
tendency and what I've seen, because I can't prove any of this. But we see that some of these movements during the middle of the day are more of I'm going to get a snack versus a full blown, I'm going a long distance for a foraging bout. And so I would just say it's probably going to be closer to cover and more of a meandering around cover.
Mhm. How long, from the GPS studies and everything else, how long is a buck usually locked onto a doe that is in estrus?
It's hard for us to tell from the GPS collar data because, like in our case, or in any cases, you don't know if you also have a measurement of the doe. You just have some bucks with collars on them, and then they kind of demonstrate this behavior that's like they might be hooked up with a doe, or they may not. Let's kind of look at it from the doe's perspective. Is that when they come into estrus, we typically think they're going to be in heat. And what I mean by that is they're going to be giving a chemical signal that they are ready to breed. They're either ready to breed, or they are in standing heat right now and are receptive. That's probably over about a 2-day period. 48 hours, would probably be the most, and probably most intensively within a 24-hour period, and maybe just a 12-hour period that they're actually in standing heat. So everybody that's hunted long enough have seen these instances where, it begins with she is emitting pheromones. That's a signal to bucks that she's about to come into heat, and bucks start chasing her. They try to locate her, and that can go on for a day. But then she finally reaches the point. So the hormonal stew in her bloodstream finally reaches a level to where she says, I'm going to stand and allow breeding to take place. And that just may be 6 to 8 or 12 hours. It's just really how quickly can a buck locate her? How long is he going to stay with that doe? What are the distractions going on? Does he know there's another female that's also an estrus? And it's really hard to pin down an individual buck's behavior because they're individuals. Another thing that we emphasize is, several bucks can also breed the same doe. So that is something we documented here, and even resulting in pregnancy. So we found out in our samples that about 25%, maybe a little more, maybe less, but around 25% in our sample, that the twin fawns that were born had different fathers.
Whoa.
And so when this doe is coming into heat, and, again, back to this individual buck, this one buck may be dominant, may be able to fend everyone off. He may protect her and have multiple breedings, or he may breed and move on, and the doe is still in standing heat and receptive. And one of those satellite, subordinate bucks comes in and gets his chance. So that is absolutely happening.
Obviously, the rut is happening at the same time every year, but in terms of daylight buck activity, what correlations can people have in mind when they're looking at the calendar, looking at the weather, of when they really need to go into their, the spot that they've kind of held sacred for a while?
Well, you probably, if you've hunted a place for a long time, you probably have a good understanding of about when that is. And there's some places in the southeast, because of genetics and restocking, where literally 1 or 2 counties over, you might have a 3-week, month difference in rut timing. But generally, it's typically the same year in, year out for a very large region. But let's say you're new to an area. How do you know? Well, what you're going to see with your camera data is you're going to see increased activity. You're going to see increased sightings before what a biologist would say the peak of the rut is. You're gonna, because the peak of the rut is peak conceptions. That's when peak breeding, and you're probably going to see less deer and less bucks during that time because they're locked up with does. So typically, it's going to be about 2 weeks. About 2 weeks before peak breeding is going to be peak buck activity, because the scent is in the air. They're starting to detect those first females are coming into heat, and so now they're all over the landscape looking for them. And then when a majority of the does come into heat, that's when detection of activity goes down. So I guess think of it that way: is if you know from a biologist, from your state wildlife agency, when peak breeding is, I would back that up about 2 weeks. And that's probably going to be peak activity in terms of seeing bucks on the hoof during daylight hours.